What I find fascinating is this idea of using metal music as a way to critique the establishment, and the establishment might be Saudi conglomerates that are buying up stuff.
Or their own king, you know, who's in Morocco, for example, who pretends to be very democratic and is relatively, you know, not as despotic as others, but it's certainly not a democracy.
Aren't there imams, though, that are speaking out against this evil, Western, satanic music?
There have been. There were satanic music scares in the Middle East in the 90s, especially in early 2000s, where, like in Egypt, for example, over 100 kids were arrested, and the Grand Mufti even said they should repent or face death. I mean, this is pretty serious. A lot of that has changed in the last decade, and people are much more tolerant. The sort of cultural attacks by the religious forces against anyone who doesn't follow their view of Islam has really gone down in most of the Muslim world, other than, let's say, Pakistan or Afghanistan. And so that's not really happening. What's really interesting, you know, I asked one of my friends when I first found out in Morocco that there was a heavy metal scene, which shocked me. So why do you play heavy metal? And he said, we play metal because our lives are metal. If you live in a hopeless society, poor, oppressive, very little future, you know, what are you going to play? You know, you're not going to play, you know, you're not going to play pop. You know, you're not going to do Celine Dion or Bruce Springsteen or something that's not necessarily political. You're going to want to do music that's hard.
But it's still electric guitar driven Western music.
Well, who's the father of heavy metal? According to Guitar Player magazine, is Dick Dale. Right, who invented the surf sound, the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean. He's Lebanese, and in fact, some of the foundations of heavy metal come out of the oud, out of Lebanese guitar playing the oud. I mean, heavy metal is not that removed, if you look at the tones, if you look at the scales, from Arab music as you would think. And remember, these people have always been globalized. You know, Morocco has been a cultural center from Africa and Europe for thousands of years. Lebanon, Egypt, they've always been globalized. They've always had, you know, other types of music. And these kids realized they had satellite. They'd see Headbangers Ball on MTV. They'd have relatives who went to the U.S. and brought back albums, and they'd hear this angry music. And heavy metal started because, you know, England and the U.S. were going through very tough economic times. Hip-hop started and punk started for the same exact reason.
Inner city.
Right. Inner city, difficult times, economic transition, loss of jobs, bad schooling. Well, that's exactly what's happening today.
So who are the Ramones in the Middle East right now? The Sex Pistols right now in the Middle East?
Well, the Sex Pistols in the Middle East, actual names of bands.
Yeah, I mean, well, do they exist? These kind of big bands that are getting a following?
Absolutely. I mean, there's festivals, for example, in Casablanca and Cairo that draw 15, 20, 30,000 people. I just played at a festival in Istanbul with a lot of metal bands from around the Middle East last fall, and CNN did a big special about it, where they had 150,000 people over 3 days to hear almost entirely local. You know, we had an Iranian band, but they had mostly Turkish and some other North African bands. So the scenes are growing quite big, and they increasingly are going to Europe, especially out of Morocco or Lebanon, where everyone speaks French. So if you go to France, one of the bands I work with is based in Paris, even though they're Moroccan, and it's becoming more and more popular, and they're working with Western rock artists. So they're starting to really cross over.
So what do you see as the hope for this Middle East? Do you think music is going to be the bridge to bring these factions together?
Well, I think it'd be incredibly naive to think music is going to be the bridge that brings us solve the problem. The Beatles. No, what music can do is show us and remind us that things are not what they seem, and that there's a lot of people who want to reach out to us and form new relationships. That's the most important thing it can do interculturally. Inside these countries, music is very important because it allows kids to create these alternative spaces where they can express themselves outside of these oppressive governments, and they can say political things, and they can raise their own consciousness. So that's the internal thing. But between cultures, you know, when you have bands in Morocco linking up with bands from England or from France, and then from America, you're creating solidarities, you're creating new relationships. That's the good part of globalization. And that hopefully then gets us to be able to go out like I'm doing or others and say, wait a second, the world is very different in the Middle East than we imagine it. So music is a bridge, it's also a mirror, and it's an opening. And if Muslims look like us, you know, if Muslims like heavy metal, and also Israelis, not just Muslims or Christians, like metal, like punk, you know, maybe they're not so different from us. So maybe what we you know, the whole justification for the war on terror, for everything we're doing, maybe needs to be rethought. That's really what I think, you know, the music makes us think.
Now, you say that you're Jewish. How much of your own spirituality do you still practice, and does that inform your own life?
Well, I think certainly the tradition informed me to try to be critical. And, you know, coming out of which not every Jewish person, it's just like, you know, I think Christianity, Islam, every good religious tradition makes you look differently at yourself and challenge yourself. So that's what it did for me. And when I go to the Middle East, you know, in many ways I feel at home. It's a culture that I feel at home in the same way I feel at home in Israel as well. And I think, you know, going there, when people find out, if you're Jewish and you're there in Lebanon or in Iran, you're also breaking boundaries down, because a lot of people have very big preconceptions about what Americans are like, what Jews are like. So in my own way, I guess I'm helping to break those down, and I'm learning too, because you know, when I was in Pakistan, I met with a bunch of university students who were dressed, they looked like Taliban, you know, and I was at an Islamic university, and I was announced to them as someone who speaks Hebrew and lived in Israel and studied in Israel, and my face turned white because this is not good.
But you also speak Arabic too.
Right. But I thought this is not good that they know, and they were like, oh wow, we speak Hebrew too. We're studying the Old Testament as part of our comparative religion. You know, so that outing of me, so to speak, opened me up to a whole perspective and made me realize how prejudiced I was being in that moment, because I was completely stereotyping these guys just because they have beards and were wearing a certain clothes, which is exactly, of course, what people do when they see metalheads.
Right. Well, thank you very much. You have a new book coming out about, we have 10 seconds. What's the title of the new book coming out?
Heavy Metal Islam, Rock Religion and the Struggle for the Soul of Islam.
There you go. You packaged it all. Thanks a lot for coming on our show tonight, Mark. It's been really fascinating.
Great, thanks.
Great. Have a great evening.
Nice to meet you.
You just heard the name of Dr. Mark Levine's new book that'll be coming out soon. The name of his most recently published book is Why They Don't Hate Us, Lifting the Veil on the Axis of Evil. I'll be right back.